Emily Carter had learned long ago that a neighborhood cafe could tell when something was wrong before the people inside it ever said a word. On most mornings, Carter's Corner Cafe welcomed the day with the familiar sounds of coffee grinding, dishes clinking, and neighbors greeting one another by name. Retired couples claimed the same corner table every Monday. Construction workers joked loudly before heading to their job sites, and teachers from the nearby elementary school stopped in for coffee before the first bell rang. Nothing about Maple Street ever changed quickly, which was exactly why everyone noticed the line of black luxury SUVs rolling slowly toward the cafe just after 8 o'clock. Conversations stopped one by one until the room became strangely quiet. Emily looked up from the espresso machine and watched through the front window as the vehicles parked neatly along the curb. Men in dark suits stepped out first, calmly scanning the sidewalks, before opening the rear door of the last SUV. A tall man emerged with the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to raise his voice to command attention. His charcoal suit fit perfectly, and a glimpse of black tattoos disappeared beneath the cuff of his white shirt whenever he adjusted his jacket. Emily recognized him immediately. Adrian Moretti, his name appeared everywhere, from financial magazines celebrating billion-dollar investments to gossip columns repeating stories nobody could prove. Some people described him as a brilliant businessman. Others lowered their voices whenever they mentioned him as if speaking too loudly might somehow reach his ears. Emily had never expected to see him standing outside the little cafe her father had built almost 30 years earlier. Adrian didn't hurry inside. Instead, he stood beneath the weathered wooden sign that read Carter's Corner Cafe and studied it with surprising patience. The faded paint, the cracked edges, even the crooked metal chain holding it above the entrance seemed to hold his attention. Emily remembered asking her father many times why he never replaced the old sign. He always smiled and answered the same way. People don't come because it's perfect. They come because it feels like home. Since his passing 2 years before, Emily had left everything exactly as he wanted it. Every scratch on the tables, every family photograph hanging on the walls, every recipe written in his careful handwriting reminded her that some things deserved to survive simply because they carried love inside them. The brass bell above the entrance rang softly as Adrian stepped into the cafe. Every customer looked up. Emily forced herself to smile despite the uneasy feeling growing inside her chest. "Good morning," she said. Adrian looked directly at her, and for one brief moment his carefully controlled expression softened in a way she could not understand. It vanished almost immediately. "Emily Carter?" he asked. "That's me." He nodded once before slowly looking around the room. His eyes paused on the framed photographs covering one wall. Birthday parties, charity breakfasts, graduation celebrations, military homecomings, wedding anniversaries. Nearly every family on Maple Street had celebrated something inside these walls. Finally, his attention settled on the oldest table in the cafe beside the front window. One leg had been repaired several times, and years of coffee cups had polished the wood until it almost glowed beneath the morning sunlight. "That table has seen better days," Emily said with an embarrassed laugh. Adrian answered quietly, "It still has many good days left." She wasn't sure why those words sounded less like an observation and more like a promise. Adrian stepped closer to the counter. "I'd like to buy this cafe." Emily blinked, convinced she had misunderstood him. "I'm sorry. I'd like to purchase it." His voice remained calm and respectful. There was no arrogance behind the offer, no pressure, no attempt to impress anyone. Emily folded her hands together. "It isn't for sale." Adrian accepted the answer without hesitation. "I understand." The simplicity of his response surprised everyone listening. He reached into his jacket, removed a plain white business card, and placed it gently on the counter. Only his name and a phone number appeared on it. "If you ever change your mind," he said, "call me." Emily looked at the card before meeting his eyes again. "May I ask why this place matters to you?" Adrian remained silent for several seconds. His gaze drifted once more toward the old table by the window. "Because some places deserve to be protected." Emily frowned. "You've never even been here." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You'd be surprised." He turned toward the entrance, then stopped with one hand resting lightly on the door. Without facing her again, he asked, "Do you still serve chicken soup on Thursdays?" Emily froze. "Yes," with fresh rosemary added during the last few minutes. She stared at him in disbelief. "How could you possibly know that?" Adrian offered no explanation. He simply nodded once before walking outside. Within moments, the convoy disappeared down Maple Street, leaving behind an uneasy silence that quickly filled with whispered conversations. Customers surrounded Emily with questions she couldn't answer. Had he threatened her? Was he buying the neighborhood? Would the cafe close? Emily only shook her head. She didn't understand any of it herself. Late that afternoon, after the lunch crowd left, Mr. Alvarez from the bookstore walked in carrying a stack of old novels. He quietly admitted that several nearby properties had already been sold to anonymous investors during the past year. The bakery had received an offer. So had the apartments across the street. Emily listened without saying much, but the conversation lingered in her thoughts long after the cafe closed for the evening. Alone inside the quiet building, she counted receipts, paid invoices, and studied another month of disappointing numbers. Rising costs, fewer customers, another expensive roof repair waiting before winter. She sighed and wandered toward the old table beside the window. Running her fingertips across the smooth wood, she found the tiny initials she had carved there as a teenager, E.C. Her father had laughed instead of scolding her, saying that every family business deserved one small reminder that love mattered more than perfection. Emily smiled sadly before switching off the lights. Across the city, Adrian Moretti stood alone inside his office overlooking thousands of glowing windows. One of his senior advisors entered, carrying several property files. "Everything on Maple Street has been secured except the cafe," he reported. Adrian remained silent. "Would you like us to increase the offer?" the advisor asked. Adrian slowly shook his head. "No." "Then how should we proceed?" Adrian finally turned away from the skyline. "No one pressures her, no one threatens her, no one even suggests closing that cafe." The advisor looked puzzled but simply nodded. After he left, Adrian unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk and removed an old photograph protected inside a worn envelope. The picture showed Carter's Corner Cafe 10 years earlier. Standing near the entrance was a young waitress carrying a steaming bowl of soup toward a rain-soaked teenage boy whose clothes were too thin for the cold autumn weather. Adrian gently brushed his thumb across the faded image before quietly whispering, "You gave everything to a stranger who had nothing." A soft knock interrupted the silence. An elderly woman who had worked for the Moretti family for decades stepped into the office, glanced at the photograph in his hands, and slowly closed her eyes. "So," she whispered with quiet understanding, "this is the woman you've been searching for all these years." Emily barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same image of Adrian Moretti standing beneath the faded wooden sign, speaking with the quiet certainty of a man who already knew the answer to questions she had not even thought to ask. By sunrise, she convinced herself she had exaggerated the entire encounter. Wealthy investors bought properties every day. Powerful men made unexpected offers. There was no reason to believe his visit had anything to do with her personally. Carter's Corner Cafe opened at 7 as it always did, and Emily buried herself in familiar routines. She mixed pancake batter, prepared fresh soup for lunch, and greeted regular customers with the same warm smile her father had taught her to wear no matter how difficult life became. The morning felt almost normal until Mrs. Henderson, who owned the flower shop 2 doors away, rushed inside carrying a folded letter in trembling hands. "They bought my building," she said quietly. Emily looked up. "Who did?" "The new owners. They want to renovate everything." Before Emily could respond, Mr. Alvarez entered from the bookstore holding a similar envelope. Then came the owner of the bakery. Within 20 minutes, 3 neighboring business owners stood inside the cafe, comparing nearly identical purchase notices. None of the letters mentioned Adrian Moretti by name. They all came from different investment companies. Yet every offer was unusually generous, and every closing date fell within the same month. The realization settled heavily over the room. Someone was quietly assembling the entire block. Emily listened without speaking. She could feel everyone's eyes drifting toward her, silently wondering whether the little cafe would become the final piece. When the lunch rush began, the conversation faded, but the tension remained. Shortly after noon, a young delivery driver arrived carrying several large wooden crates. "Delivery for Carter's Corner," he announced. Emily frowned. "There must be a mistake. I didn't order anything." The driver checked his paperwork, paid in full. Curious, she opened the first crate. Inside stood a brand new commercial refrigerator, far newer than the aging unit that had struggled through the previous summer. The second crate contained a professional espresso machine, worth more than the cafe's monthly revenue. The third held kitchen equipment she had only admired in restaurant supply catalogs. Emily immediately refused the shipment. "I can't accept this." The driver looked apologetic. "I'm afraid I can't take it back unless the sender authorizes the return." "Who's the sender?" He handed her a small envelope. Inside was a single handwritten note, "For a place that deserves to stay open." No signature, no company name, nothing else. Emily folded the note and slipped it into her apron pocket without another word. The customers noticed the delivery, and speculation spread through the neighborhood before the afternoon was over. Some believed she had secretly sold the cafe. Others insisted the mysterious investor was preparing to turn the building into an expensive restaurant. Emily denied every rumor, but even she no longer knew what to believe. That evening, after the last customer left, she called the phone number on Adrian's business card. The line rang only once. "Emily Carter," his calm voice suggested he had expected her call. "Did you send those deliveries?" A brief silence followed. "Yes." "Why?" "Because your refrigerator is 23 years old." Emily stared at the old appliance humming loudly in the corner. "How could you possibly know that? It breaks down every August." She felt a chill run through her. "Have you been watching my cafe?" "No." "Then how do you know these things?" Adrian answered with quiet honesty. "Because I remember them." Emily tightened her grip on the phone. "We have never met." Another pause. "Not the way you remember meeting someone." The answer only deepened the mystery. "I can't accept expensive gifts from a stranger." "Then don't think of them as gifts." "What should I think of them as?" Adrian spoke so softly she almost missed his words. "A debt." Before Emily could ask what he meant, he politely ended the call with a simple, "Good night, Emily." She lowered the phone slowly, feeling more confused than before she had dialed. Across the city, Adrian stood alone in the private library of the Moretti estate, holding the same faded photograph he had looked at the previous evening. The elderly housekeeper, Rosa, quietly entered carrying a tray with untouched tea. She had served 3 generations of the Moretti family, and had watched Adrian grow from a frightened teenager into one of the most powerful men in the city. "You finally spoke to her," Rosa said gently. Adrian nodded without lifting his eyes from the photograph. "She doesn't remember me." Rosa smiled with quiet sadness. Why would she to her? It was one bowl of soup on one rainy afternoon. Adrian looked out the window into the darkness beyond the gardens. "To me, it was the first time anyone looked at me and saw a person instead of a problem." Rosa studied him for a long moment before asking the question she had carried for 10 years. "Are you going to tell her who you were?" Adrian slowly placed the photograph back inside its envelope. "Not yet." "Why?" His expression hardened with quiet resolve. "Because she already has enough people trying to take that cafe away. If she learns who I really was before she learns why I came back, she'll never believe a single word I say." At that exact moment, neither Adrian nor Emily realized someone else had been watching every step of their unexpected reunion. From the upper floor of an office building overlooking Maple Street, a wealthy real estate developer lowered a pair of binoculars, glanced at a file labeled *Carter's Corner Redevelopment, and quietly smiled before saying to the man beside him, "If Adrian Moretti cares about that little cafe, then we've finally found his weakness." The rumor spread across Maple Street much faster than Emily expected. By Wednesday morning, nearly everyone had heard that Adrian Moretti had personally called Carter's Corner Café, and somehow that single piece of information became half a dozen different stories before breakfast was over. Some people insisted Emily had already accepted a private offer. Others claimed the billionaire planned to replace the cafe with a luxury hotel. A few whispered that she was secretly negotiating behind everyone's back. Emily tried to ignore the gossip, but every sympathetic smile and every curious glance reminded her that the neighborhood was beginning to look at her differently. She hated it. Carter's Corner had always been a place where people trusted one another, and now uncertainty was quietly replacing that trust. She buried herself in work, hoping routine would drown out the noise. She prepared soup, baked fresh pies, balanced invoices, and smiled at customers even when her thoughts refused to settle. Around noon, Mrs. Henderson entered, carrying a small potted lavender plant. "I thought the cafe could use a little color," she said with a gentle smile before lowering her voice. "Don't let people pressure you into anything, Emily. Your father loved this place too much." Emily thanked her warmly, but before she could answer, another customer interrupted to ask whether the cafe would still be open next month. That simple question lingered in the air long after the customer had left. For the first time since inheriting the business, Emily realized that uncertainty alone could damage a place almost as much as demolition. Later that afternoon, she received a phone call from the city planning office, requesting her attendance at a public redevelopment meeting, scheduled for Friday evening. The invitation sounded routine, yet something about the formal tone unsettled her. After hanging up, she walked outside to clear her mind. Across the street, several surveyors wearing reflective vests were measuring sidewalks and marking sections of pavement with bright orange paint. None of them looked toward the cafe, but Emily could not shake the feeling that invisible lines were slowly closing around the neighborhood. As she watched, a familiar black sedan quietly stopped on the opposite side of the street. Adrian Moretti stepped out alone, without the convoy that had accompanied him days earlier. This time he wore a dark overcoat instead of a tailored suit, making him appear almost ordinary until people recognized his face. He crossed the street without hesitation and stopped outside the cafe. Emily opened the door before he could step inside. "You're becoming difficult to ignore," she said, unable to hide the frustration in her voice. Adrian offered a calm nod. "That wasn't my intention. Then what is?" He looked past her toward the warm lights inside the cafe before answering. "To make sure you're all right." Emily folded her arms. "You barely know me. Perhaps." "No, not perhaps." Her voice remained steady, though her heartbeat quickened. "You keep saying things that don't make sense. You know my father's recipe, you know my equipment, you know details you shouldn't know. And now everyone thinks I'm selling the cafe because of you." Adrian listened without interrupting. When she finished, he quietly said, "I'm sorry." The apology caught her completely off guard. It carried no defensiveness, no attempt to justify himself, only genuine regret. "I never wanted my presence to make your life harder." Emily studied his face, searching for arrogance or manipulation, but found neither. Instead, she saw exhaustion, the kind that settled into someone's eyes after carrying something heavy for far too long. "Then tell me the truth," she said softly. "Why does this place matter so much?" Adrian remained silent for several long seconds. The afternoon breeze stirred fallen leaves across the sidewalk, while passing cars filled the space between them with brief moments of noise. Finally, he answered, "Because someone here changed the course of my life." Emily waited for him to continue, but he didn't. "Who?" she asked. Adrian looked directly into her eyes. "One day I'll tell you." Before she could respond, a black pickup truck suddenly accelerated around the corner far faster than it should have on the narrow street. The driver seemed distracted, drifting dangerously close to the curb where Emily stood. Adrian reacted instantly. Without thinking, he stepped forward, wrapped one arm around her shoulders, and pulled her safely backward just as the truck clipped a row of outdoor flower pots, shattering them across the sidewalk before speeding away without stopping. Everything happened in only a few seconds. Emily found herself pressed against Adrian's chest, hearing the steady rhythm of his heartbeat while broken clay scattered across the pavement. Customers rushed outside. Mr. Alvarez shouted after the fleeing truck, but it disappeared before anyone could read the license plate. Adrian slowly released Emily the moment he knew she was safe. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head, still trying to catch her breath. "No." Their eyes met for a brief moment that felt strangely longer than it should have. Emily realized his first instinct had not been to protect himself, but to protect her. It was a reflex, not a decision. Before either of them could say another word, police sirens echoed in the distance. Adrian stepped back, his expression returning to the careful composure she had first seen days earlier. "You should go inside," he said quietly. "What about you? I'll handle this." Emily wanted to argue, but something in his voice told her he had already made up his mind. As officers arrived and began taking statements, Adrian walked a short distance away and spoke briefly with one of his security men, who had appeared almost out of nowhere. Emily couldn't hear the conversation, but she noticed the subtle change in Adrian's face as his security chief handed him a mobile phone. Whatever he heard caused every trace of warmth to disappear from his eyes. Across town, inside an elegant office overlooking the river, the wealthy developer Victor Lang watched security footage replaying the near collision outside the cafe. He leaned back in his chair, smiled without satisfaction, and quietly said, "He moved exactly as I hoped he would." The man standing beside him frowned. It was only a warning. Victor closed the video and rested his hands on the desk. "No," he replied. "It was a test." He looked toward a blueprint of the Maple Street redevelopment project spread across the table before adding in a calm voice. And now I know Adrian Moretti will risk everything for that woman, which means the cafe was never the real target. Emily told herself the incident with the pickup truck had been an accident, but the explanation became harder to believe with every passing hour. The broken flower pots were cleaned away before sunset, the police completed their reports, and Maple Street slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Yet an invisible tension refused to leave. Customers continued filling the cafe, but conversations grew quieter whenever they noticed Emily looking toward the front window. Everyone had seen Adrian Moretti pull her out of danger. Everyone had seen the look in his eyes afterward. It was not the reaction of a businessman protecting an investment. It was the instinct of someone terrified of losing a person who mattered. Emily replayed that moment in her mind countless times, trying to understand why a stranger would move without hesitation. Why his first words had not been about the reckless driver but about whether she was hurt. She had thanked him before he left, yet the gratitude only deepened the mystery surrounding him. By Thursday morning, another surprise was waiting. 2 electricians stood outside the cafe with work orders to replace the failing exterior lights and repair damaged wiring that had become a safety hazard. Emily immediately refused the service. "I didn't hire anyone," she explained. One of the workers politely handed her a permit already approved by the city. "Payment has been made in advance." Emily sighed. She didn't need to ask who had arranged it. She called Adrian's number before the workers had even packed their tools. He answered almost immediately. "Good morning, Emily. Please stop doing this." His voice remained calm. "Doing what?" "Fixing things that aren't yours to fix." There was a brief pause before he replied. "If something can be made safer, I don't see a reason to leave it broken." Emily closed her eyes, trying to remain patient. "You don't owe me anything." "I disagree." "Then tell me what debt you're trying to repay." Silence filled the line. When Adrian finally spoke, his voice sounded quieter than before. "If I tell you now, you'll think I'm asking for something in return." "Are you?" "No." "Then why won't you explain?" Adrian took a slow breath. "Because kindness loses its meaning when it's used as currency." Before Emily could answer, he added gently, "Tell the electricians to finish the work. After that, I won't send anyone else without asking." It wasn't the answer she wanted, but she sensed he meant every word. She thanked him almost reluctantly before ending the call. The repairs were completed that afternoon, and for the first time in months, the lights above the cafe entrance shone brightly enough to illuminate the entire sidewalk. Several neighbors stopped to compliment the improvement, unaware of who had paid for it. Emily accepted their smiles but kept Adrian's name to herself. That evening, the city hosted the redevelopment meeting inside the old community center. Business owners, residents, and city officials filled nearly every seat. Large presentation boards displayed modern apartment buildings, luxury retail spaces, landscaped walkways, and underground parking garages. The speaker described economic growth, increased tourism, and higher property values. The presentation was polished, optimistic, and convincing. Then the final rendering appeared on the screen. Carter's Corner Café was gone. In its place stood a glass office lobby surrounded by decorative trees. Emily felt the air leave her lungs. "Excuse me," she said, rising from her chair. "Where is my café?" The presenter smiled politely. "That property is included in Phase 3 of the redevelopment. I never agreed to sell. We hope you'll reconsider once negotiations begin, and if I don't." Before the presenter could answer, another voice came from the back of the room. "Then the project adapts." Every head turned. Adrian Moretti stood near the entrance wearing a dark suit with no security visible beside him. Victor Lang, the developer leading the meeting, looked genuinely surprised to see him. Adrian walked calmly toward the front without taking his eyes off the architectural drawings. "A neighborhood isn't improved by erasing the places people love," he said. Victor offered a practiced smile. "Mr. Moretti, I wasn't aware you'd be joining us." "Neither was I," Adrian replied, "until I saw these plans." The room fell silent. Victor clasped his hands together. Progress requires difficult choices. Adrian looked toward the image of the missing cafe. No bad planning requires difficult choices. A few people quietly applauded before quickly stopping, uncertain whether they should. Emily watched the exchange with growing confusion. Adrian had purchased buildings across Maple Street, yet he was publicly opposing the very redevelopment everyone assumed he supported. Victor maintained his smile, but something colder flickered beneath it. I'm sure we can discuss our differences privately. Adrian answered without hesitation. There are no private differences when an entire community is affected. The meeting ended earlier than expected, leaving residents gathered in small groups discussing what they had witnessed. As Emily stepped outside into the cool evening air, Adrian caught up with her near the entrance. "Are you all right?" he asked. She gave a small, tired laugh. "People keep asking me that, because they're worried." Emily looked at him carefully. "Why were you really there tonight?" Adrian glanced toward the community center, where Victor Lang was speaking quietly with several city officials. "Because someone needed to say no." Emily studied him for a long moment. "You're not the man everyone thinks you are." A faint sadness crossed his face. "Neither are most people." Before she could ask another question, Adrian's phone vibrated. He read the message, and the warmth disappeared from his expression almost instantly. His security chief had sent only one sentence. Asterisk, someone broke into Carter's Corner Café 20 minutes ago. Nothing was stolen. Adrian looked toward Emily, then toward the dark street leading back to Maple Street, and a single thought settled heavily in his mind. Whoever had entered the cafe had not come to take something. They had come to leave something behind. Emily's heart pounded throughout the drive back to Maple Street. Adrian followed several car lengths behind, saying nothing, allowing her to arrive first. Red and blue police lights reflected across the rain-soaked windows of Carter's Corner Café, turning the familiar storefront into something strangely unfamiliar. The front door showed no signs of forced entry. The lock remained intact. The windows were untouched. Whoever had entered knew exactly how to avoid leaving obvious damage. Emily hurried inside, expecting overturned chairs or broken shelves, but everything appeared exactly as she had left it before attending the redevelopment meeting. The coffee cups remained stacked neatly behind the counter. The pastry display was still covered. Even the old cash register sat in its usual place. One of the officers approached her with a puzzled expression. "Nothing seems to be missing," he said. "We're checking fingerprints, but whoever came in was careful." Emily slowly walked through the dining room, her eyes scanning every corner. The silence inside the cafe felt heavier than before, as though the building itself knew someone had crossed an invisible line. Adrian entered only after the officers nodded that the scene was secure. He remained several steps behind Emily, giving her space instead of trying to lead the situation. She appreciated that more than she expected. Reaching the old wooden table beside the front window, she instinctively rested one hand on its worn surface. Something felt different. She looked down. A plain white coffee mug sat exactly in the center of the table. She was certain it had not been there earlier. There was no logo, no decoration, only a folded piece of paper tucked beneath it. Emily carefully unfolded the note, while the room around her seemed to grow even quieter. The message contained only 6 typed words. Some memories should stay buried forever. No signature, no explanation. Emily read the sentence twice before handing the paper to the officer. "Did anyone see this before I came?" He shook his head. "No. We left everything exactly where we found it." Adrian stared at the note without touching it. The calm expression he usually carried disappeared for only a fraction of a second, replaced by unmistakable concern. Emily noticed it immediately. "You know what this means, don't you?" she asked softly. Adrian answered honestly. "I know it's not about the cafe." She looked at him in confusion. "Then what is it about?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Someone doesn't want the past to come back." Before Emily could respond, the lead detective approached, carrying a small evidence bag. Inside lay an old brass key discovered beneath the same wooden table. "Does this belong to you?" he asked. Emily frowned. "I've never seen it before." The detective turned toward Adrian. "What about you?" Adrian studied the worn key through the clear plastic without answering immediately. It looked strangely familiar, but he could not remember why. "No," he finally said. Though uncertainty lingered in his voice, the detective nodded and walked away. Emily looked at Adrian again. "You're hiding something," he met her eyes without looking away. "I'm trying to protect something. Those aren't the same thing." Adrian lowered his voice. "Sometimes they are." The words frustrated her more than they comforted her. She wanted facts, not riddles. She wanted answers, not quiet promises. After the police finished collecting evidence, Emily locked the cafe again. But she no longer felt safe inside the place that had always been her refuge. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, Adrian noticed her glance toward the dark windows with hesitation. "You're not staying here tonight," he said. Emily immediately shook her head. I can take care of myself. I don't doubt that, then stop deciding what's best for me. Adrian accepted the sharpness in her voice without reacting. I'm asking, not ordering. She folded her arms. And my answer is no. Adrian looked down the empty street before speaking again. The person who entered your cafe wanted you to know they could reach you whenever they wanted. That wasn't theft. It was a message. Emily remained silent because deep down she knew he was right. Still, trusting him felt dangerous in a completely different way. She barely knew this man, yet he somehow knew details about her life that no stranger should know. Before either of them could continue, Rosa's words echoed in Adrian's memory from years earlier. One day she'll have to choose whether to trust your past or your present. He had hoped that day would come much later. Instead, it had arrived before he was ready. Emily finally spoke. If you're telling me the truth, then tell me all of it. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. Every instinct told him that revealing his connection to her now would only place her in greater danger, especially if Victor Lang had already realized the cafe represented more than real estate. I can't, he admitted. Disappointment spread slowly across Emily's face. Not anger, not fear, just quiet disappointment. Then I can't trust you. The sentence landed harder than any threat Adrian had faced in years. He gave a slow nod, accepting that he had earned exactly that response. I understand. Emily turned away and walked toward her car without looking back. Adrian watched until her headlights disappeared at the end of Maple Street before returning to his own vehicle. Inside, his security chief was waiting with new information. We identified the brass key, he said, handing Adrian a digital photograph from the evidence database. Adrian looked at the image and his expression changed instantly. He knew that key. He had held it once before, 10 years earlier, on the coldest night of his life. It belonged to the storage locker where a frightened 16-year-old boy had hidden everything he owned after running away from the streets. The same locker where he had left behind the only object connecting him to the woman who had shown him unexpected kindness. Adrian looked up slowly, the realization hitting him with chilling clarity. Whoever had broken into the cafe didn't just know his past. They knew the one secret he had spent a decade protecting, and if they had found the key, then they were only one step away from finding what was still hidden inside the locker. Adrian did not go home that night. Instead, he drove through the empty streets until the city lights gave way to an aging industrial district that had long been forgotten by everyone, except the people who still had reasons to remember it. The storage facility looked exactly as it had 10 years earlier, its concrete walls stained by time, and its narrow hallways illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed softly in the silence. He parked several blocks away, entered through a side gate, and walked alone toward Locker 217. The old brass key discovered beneath Emily's cafe had unlocked this door once before, on the night he believed his life would never become anything more than survival. His hand rested on the cold metal handle for several seconds before he finally opened it. The room was barely larger than a closet. Dust covered everything inside. A worn backpack leaned against one wall. An old winter jacket hung from a rusty hook. A cardboard box sat untouched in the corner exactly where he had left it years ago. Adrian slowly opened the box, relieved to find its contents still there. A faded blue blanket, 2 school notebooks, a broken pocket watch that had never worked, and beneath them all, carefully wrapped inside a clean kitchen towel, rested a small ceramic soup bowl with a tiny chip along its rim. He lifted it with both hands as though it were made of glass. To anyone else, it was worthless. To Adrian, it represented the first meal someone had ever given him without expecting anything in return. 10 years earlier, he had accidentally walked away with the bowl after collapsing from exhaustion outside Carter's Corner Café. Emily had laughed when she realized what happened and told the frightened teenager to bring it back whenever life became better. She probably forgot those words before the week ended. Adrian never did. He had planned to return it countless times, but each year the distance between the frightened boy he once was and the man he became made the task feel more impossible. He gently traced the chipped edge with his thumb before placing it back inside the towel. Someone knew about this locker now. Someone wanted him to believe the past was no longer safe. His phone vibrated. It was Rosa. "Did you find everything?" she asked. "Nothing has been taken," Adrian answered. "Not yet." Rosa remained quiet for a moment before speaking again. "Then perhaps they wanted you to come back." Adrian considered the possibility. She was right. If the intruder had truly wanted whatever was inside the locker, They could have forced it open themselves. Instead, they left the key beneath Emily's table. It was an invitation, or a warning. Meanwhile, Emily arrived at the cafe before sunrise, determined to prove to herself that fear would not steal another ordinary day from her customers. She unlocked the front door, switched on the lights, and immediately noticed a folded newspaper resting on the counter. She was certain it had not been there when the police left. The front page headline celebrated Victor Lang's redevelopment project, praising it as the future of Maple Street. Tucked inside the paper was another typed message. Some people protect buildings, others protect memories. Choose carefully. Emily's stomach tightened. She looked around the empty cafe, suddenly aware that whoever had entered before might still be watching from somewhere outside. She called the detective assigned to the case, who promised to collect the note within the hour. After hanging up, she glanced toward the old by the window. For the first time in years, she noticed something she had somehow overlooked. Beneath the tabletop, hidden where no customer would normally look, someone had carved a tiny date into the wood. October 14, 10 years earlier. Emily frowned. She ran her fingers across the faded numbers, trying to remember why that date felt strangely familiar. She searched through old accounting books kept in a cabinet behind the counter until she found the ledger from that year. The pages smelled of dust and coffee. Every day's receipts had been carefully recorded in her father's handwriting. When she reached October 14, a small note written in the margin caught her attention. Rain all day. Young boy came in soaked. Emily insisted on feeding him for free. Good kid, returned the smile before he left. Emily stared at the sentence, her heart beginning to beat faster. She remembered the rain. She remembered the exhausted teenager who looked too proud to admit he was hungry. She remembered placing a bowl of soup in front of him, despite his repeated attempts to pay with a handful of coins, but she could not remember his face. She closed the ledger slowly, her thoughts interrupted by the sound of the bell above the entrance. Adrian stepped inside carrying no security, no briefcase, and no carefully rehearsed explanation. His eyes met hers, then drifted toward the open ledger resting on the counter. He immediately recognized the page. Emily spoke before he could. 10 years ago, a boy came here during a storm. Adrian remained still. Yes, my father wrote about him. Another quiet pause settled between them. Emily looked directly into his eyes. Did you know that boy? Adrian felt the truth pressing harder against the silence than ever before. He could lie, he could avoid the question again, or he could finally begin opening the door he had kept locked for a decade. Before he answered, the cafe television mounted in the corner suddenly interrupted its morning program with breaking news. The reporter announced that a fire had destroyed an abandoned storage facility overnight on the east side of the city. As images appeared on the screen, Adrian's face lost all color. Flames were pouring from the exact building where locker 217 had been only minutes after he left, and the camera slowly zoomed in on firefighters carrying a single smoke-blackened cardboard box out of the ruins. Neither Emily nor anyone else inside the cafe understood why the color drained from Adrian's face the moment the burning storage facility appeared on the television screen. To everyone else, it was simply another overnight fire in an abandoned part of the city. To Adrian, it felt as though someone had reached into the only corner of his past he had never allowed anyone to touch. He stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the live broadcast as firefighters carried a smoke-blackened cardboard box through the haze. The reporter explained that investigators had not yet determined the cause of the fire, but believed someone had entered the building shortly before midnight. Emily looked from the television back to Adrian. His silence answered more than his words ever had. "You know that place," she said quietly. Adrian lowered his eyes for a brief moment, before giving a slow nod. "I do. Were you there?" "Yes." She waited for him to explain, but once again he hesitated. The hesitation hurt more than she expected. During the past few days, she had watched him protect her without asking for recognition, defend her cafe in public, apologize when he believed he had made her life more difficult, and quietly repair things she could no longer afford to fix. None of those actions matched the dangerous reputation that surrounded his name. Yet every time she came close to understanding him, another wall appeared between them. "I'm tired of half the truth," she whispered. Adrian looked at her with unmistakable regret. "So am I." Before either of them could continue, his phone vibrated. It was his security chief. The message contained only 4 words. "The box survived the fire. Adrian immediately stepped outside to return the call. Emily watched through the window as his calm expression gave way to visible urgency. He spoke for less than a minute before ending the conversation and standing completely still beneath the old cafe sign. For the first time since they met, she saw uncertainty in him. Not fear for himself, but fear that something precious had already been lost. Across town, the fire scene remained under police control. Adrian arrived within minutes, presenting identification before walking toward the firefighters who had recovered the damaged box. Most of its contents had been destroyed by smoke and water, but several items remained recognizable. The old winter jacket had burned beyond repair. The notebooks had turned to ash. The broken pocket watch had melted into a shapeless piece of metal. Only one object had survived almost untouched. Wrapped inside layers of scorched kitchen towels lay the small ceramic soup bowl with the chipped rim. Adrian stared at it in silence. One firefighter smiled gently. "Funny thing," he said. "Everything else burned, but someone packed this bowl like it was priceless." Adrian carefully lifted it from the box. "To me, it is." The firefighter nodded without asking another question. Nearby, investigators searched through security footage from neighboring warehouses. One detective approached Adrian carrying a tablet. "We found someone entering the building after you left," he explained. Grainy black and white video showed a hooded figure unlocking the storage facility with surprising confidence before disappearing inside for nearly 15 minutes. The person's face remained hidden beneath a cap, but one detail caught Adrian's attention immediately. The figure walked with a slight limp in the left leg. Adrian had seen that walk before. He simply could not remember where. Meanwhile, back at the cafe, Emily reopened the old accounting ledger, unable to let go of the memory her father's note had awakened. She searched through photo albums stored in the office, until she found a faded picture taken during a neighborhood charity lunch 10 years earlier. The image showed volunteers serving food while children laughed in the background. Near the edge of the photograph, almost hidden behind the cafe door, stood a thin teenage boy wearing an oversized jacket. His face was partly turned away from the camera, but Emily instantly recognized the bowl in his hands. The same plain white ceramic bowl her father had used for homemade soup every Thursday. She leaned closer. There was something strangely familiar about the boy's posture. Before she could study the picture any longer, Rosa quietly entered the cafe. Emily recognized her from Adrian's office. The elderly woman smiled warmly. "May I sit for a moment?" Emily nodded, sensing that Rosa had come for a reason. After ordering tea, Rosa looked around the cafe with moist eyes. "It hasn't changed very much." Emily smiled politely. "My father believed memories deserved a place to live." Rosa looked toward the old table beside the window. He was right. A long silence settled between them before Rosa reached into her handbag and removed an old cloth napkin, carefully unfolding it on the table. Embroidered in one corner were the faded initials CTC. Carter's Corner Café. Emily frowned. "Where did you get that?" Rosa's gentle smile carried years of quiet understanding. "A frightened boy accidentally carried it away one rainy afternoon." Emily's heart skipped. Rosa continued before she could speak. "He meant to return it the very next day. Then life pulled him somewhere else." Emily slowly looked from the napkin to the photograph still lying open beside her, the teenage boy, the soup, the storm, the strange questions Adrian had asked. The rosemary, the old table, the cafe. One by one, the scattered pieces began fitting together. She looked at Rosa, almost afraid to ask the question forming in her mind. "That boy?" Rosa nodded softly before Emily could finish. "Yes." Emily felt her breath catch. "Adrian." Rosa lowered her eyes with a bittersweet smile. "He never came back because he was ashamed that the boy you helped no longer existed." Emily looked again at the faded photograph, then at the cloth napkin resting in front of her. Every mysterious act suddenly carried a different meaning. He had not been buying a building. He had been trying to protect the place where hope had first found him. At that exact moment, Adrian's car pulled into Maple Street. He stepped out, carrying the chipped ceramic soup bowl wrapped carefully in a clean white towel. Before he could reach the cafe door, a black sedan stopped across the street. Victor Lang calmly stepped onto the sidewalk, smiled toward Adrian, and held up a second object for him to see. It was another old photograph from the same rainy afternoon 10 years earlier. But this one showed something Adrian had never realized anyone had captured. a teenage boy standing in the doorway while Emily quietly slipped the last $20 from the cafe register into the pocket of his worn jacket, after pretending not to notice he had no money at all. Victor's smile widened as he folded the photograph and said, "Now imagine what she'll think when she learns the rest of the story." Adrian stood perfectly still as Victor Lang held the faded photograph between two fingers, allowing the afternoon breeze to lift one corner before carefully folding it again. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The traffic on Maple Street continued as usual. Customers entered nearby shops, and children laughed on their way home from school, completely unaware that a decade of carefully guarded memories now rested inside a single envelope. Adrian's eyes never left the photograph. "Where did you get it?" he asked quietly. Victor smiled with the calm confidence of someone who believed he finally controlled the conversation. "Does it matter?" Adrian took one slow step forward. "It does." Victor slipped the photograph back into his jacket. "People spend their lives protecting money, power, and reputation. You chose to protect a memory. I found that interesting." Adrian understood immediately. This had never been about the redevelopment project alone. Victor had spent days testing him, watching his reactions, measuring how far he would go to protect Emily and the cafe. The staged near collision, the anonymous notes, the break-in, even the fire at the storage facility had all served one purpose. They were designed to force Adrian into revealing what mattered most. "Leave her out of this," Adrian said. Victor laughed softly. "I would love to. Unfortunately, she's the reason you're standing here instead of negotiating from your office." Adrian remained silent. He had spent years building a reputation that kept dangerous people at a distance, yet the one weakness he had never hidden from himself had become visible to someone patient enough to look for it. Victor leaned slightly closer. "You know what I discovered," he said. "People don't fear losing buildings. They fear losing the people those buildings remind them of." Before Adrian could answer, Emily stepped out of the cafe, having watched enough through the front window to realize the conversation had become something far more serious than another business meeting. Her eyes moved from Adrian to Victor and finally settled on the envelope in Victor's hand. "What's going on?" she asked. Victor turned toward her with the polished smile of a practiced businessman. "Miss Carter, I believe this belongs to you." He extended the photograph. Emily accepted it cautiously and unfolded the faded image. Her heart immediately recognized the rainy afternoon, long before her mind did. There she was, 10 years younger, placing a bowl of soup on the table. A soaked teenage boy stood near the entrance with uncertainty written across his face. Then her eyes drifted lower. She saw her younger self quietly slipping folded bills into the pocket of the boy's jacket, while pretending to wipe crumbs from the table so he would never feel embarrassed. Emily looked up slowly, then back at the photograph, then at Adrian. The pieces finally aligned with breathtaking clarity. The rosemary, the soup, the old table, the storage locker, the strange debt he kept mentioning. "It was you," she whispered. Adrian did not look away. "Yes." Emily felt tears gathering before she even realized she was crying. "You were that boy." He nodded once. "I came back the next day to return the bowl." His voice trembled almost imperceptibly. "The cafe was closed. Someone told me your father had taken you to visit your grandmother for a week. By the time you returned," he paused, "my life had already gone somewhere I never wanted you to see." Emily lowered her eyes to the photograph again. She remembered almost nothing about the hungry teenager except that her father had insisted no one should ever leave their cafe believing kindness had to be earned. Adrian continued quietly, "You didn't just feed me. You gave me enough money to sleep somewhere warm that night." Emily frowned. "I don't remember doing that." "I do." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 10 years. Victor watched the exchange with growing irritation. This was not how he had imagined the moment unfolding. He had expected anger, suspicion, perhaps even rejection. Instead, the truth was quietly dissolving every misunderstanding he had tried to build. "How touching," Victor interrupted. "Unfortunately, sentiment doesn't change contracts." He signaled toward one of his assistants waiting nearby. The man immediately handed Emily a thick legal folder. Victor spoke with renewed confidence. "Several months ago, city officials approved redevelopment authority over this block. There was one condition. Every property owner had to receive a fair purchase offer before eminent domain proceedings could begin. You refused every offer. Congratulations, you fulfilled the final requirement." Emily's face lost color as she quickly scanned the documents: legal notices, city approvals, acquisition timelines, demolition schedules. Carter's Corner Café had been marked for demolition within 30 days. Adrian calmly took the folder from her hands and closed it. "It won't happen." Victor smiled. "You no longer own enough neighboring properties to stop the vote." Adrian looked directly into his eyes. "I wasn't buying those buildings to profit from them." Victor's smile faded slightly. Adrian reached into his inside pocket and removed another folder, handing it to Victor this time. "Read the last page." Victor opened it confidently, but his expression changed almost immediately. Every property Adrian had quietly purchased over the previous year had already been transferred into an independent historical preservation trust established the night before. None of the buildings could now be demolished without unanimous approval from the trust's board, local preservation authorities, and the community itself. Adrian had never intended to replace Maple Street. He had spent months protecting it from exactly the kind of project Victor wanted to build. Victor looked up in disbelief. "You gave away properties worth hundreds of millions of dollars," Adrian answered without hesitation. "Some places are worth more than money." For the first time since they met, Victor's confidence disappeared completely. The legal foundation of his redevelopment project collapsed in a single moment. Several city officials who had quietly supported the plan began distancing themselves almost immediately, realizing the approvals they had relied upon were now effectively meaningless. News reporters who had arrived hoping to cover another business announcement instead surrounded Victor with uncomfortable questions about pressure tactics, anonymous threats, and suspicious fires connected to the project. Cameras turned away from Adrian and toward the developer, who suddenly found himself struggling to explain decisions that had seemed untouchable only hours earlier. Emily watched the scene unfold in stunned silence. Adrian could have used his wealth to overpower Victor. Instead, he had used it months earlier to protect people who would never even know his name was responsible. As reporters continued asking questions, Victor took one last look at Adrian before quietly saying, "This isn't over." Adrian's expression remained calm. "For you, it is." Police investigators crossed the street carrying new evidence recovered from the burned storage facility. One detective approached Victor instead of Adrian. "Mr. Lang," he said, "we need to ask you several questions regarding the fire, the anonymous threats, and financial records connected to your redevelopment company." Victor's face hardened as the detective continued speaking. Emily slowly reached for the old photograph still resting in her hands. She looked at the frightened teenage boy one more time before raising her eyes toward the man standing only a few feet away. After 10 years, she finally knew who he was. What she still didn't know was whether she had enough courage to open the final chapter of the story they had unknowingly begun on that rainy afternoon. The weeks that followed felt strangely peaceful, as though Maple Street had finally been allowed to breathe again after holding its breath for far too long. News of Victor Lang's investigation spread quickly throughout the city. Financial records connected him to fraudulent redevelopment contracts, anonymous shell companies, and the intimidation campaign that had targeted several small business owners. The attempted manipulation of Carter's Corner Café became only one piece of a much larger case, and before long, the same confidence Victor had carried into every meeting disappeared behind courtroom doors and legal proceedings. Emily followed the headlines only long enough to know that justice was finally moving forward. She had spent too much of her life protecting what she loved to waste another day watching someone else's downfall. Instead, she focused on the cafe. The new exterior lights welcomed customers each evening, laughter gradually returned to the dining room, and neighbors who had once feared losing their businesses began stopping by simply to say thank you. Some thanked Emily for refusing to give up. Others quietly admitted they had judged Adrian too quickly. Emily never corrected anyone. She knew better than most that people often carried stories the world never bothered to ask about. Adrian, meanwhile, kept his promise. He never appeared without calling first. He never sent expensive gifts again. If something needed repairing, he asked permission. If Emily declined, he accepted her answer without argument. Their conversations remained simple at first. Sometimes they spoke for only a few minutes over coffee before he returned to work. Other days they walked quietly through Maple Street after closing, speaking about ordinary things that had nothing to do with danger, money, or the past. Emily slowly discovered that beneath Adrian's carefully controlled exterior lived a man who still noticed small details most people overlooked. He remembered which customers preferred extra cinnamon on their oatmeal. He remembered the names of elderly neighbors he had met only once. He remembered every recipe Emily's father had ever served on Thursdays. More importantly, he remembered what it felt like to have nothing. One rainy afternoon, nearly a month after Victor's arrest, Adrian arrived, carrying a small wooden box wrapped in plain brown paper. He placed it gently on the old table beside the window. "I believe this belongs here," he said. Emily carefully opened the box. Inside rested the chipped white ceramic soup bowl, cleaned, restored, and protected inside soft linen. She lifted it slowly, tracing the tiny crack along its rim with her fingertips. "You kept this all these years." Adrian smiled with quiet embarrassment. "I was supposed to return it the next day." Emily laughed softly through tears. "You're only 10 years late." Adrian lowered his eyes, the corners of his mouth lifting just enough to reveal the shy young man he had once been. "I've been late to a lot of important things." Emily reached across the table and rested one hand gently over his. "You're here now." Neither of them spoke for several moments. The silence no longer felt awkward. It felt earned. A few days later, Maple Street held its annual neighborhood festival, the first one organized since the redevelopment project had officially been canceled. Families filled the sidewalks, local musicians played outside the bookstore, children painted colorful murals on temporary wooden panels, and the smell of fresh bread drifted through the afternoon air. Carter's Corner Café served free bowls of chicken soup to anyone who wanted one, just as Emily's father had done every autumn for years. Adrian quietly stood behind the serving counter, wearing a simple apron that looked strangely ordinary on someone the city considered untouchable. Several children laughed when they recognized him from television, surprised to see him washing dishes beside retirees and college students. He laughed with them, and for perhaps the first time in many years, no one looked at him with fear. Late that afternoon, Rosa slowly approached the old table by the front window, carrying a small framed photograph. It was the same faded picture taken during the rainy afternoon 10 years earlier, now professionally restored. She placed it beside the soup bowl without saying a word. Emily studied the image for a long time before smiling. "I almost forgot his face," she admitted. Adrian looked at the photograph and then at Emily. "I never forgot yours." The words were spoken so quietly that only she heard them. As the festival came to an end and the last customers wandered home beneath a sky glowing with the colors of sunset, Emily locked the cafe door and switched off the lights. Adrian waited outside instead of assuming he should walk beside her. She stepped onto the sidewalk, slipped the keys into her pocket, and looked up at the weathered wooden sign her father had loved so much. "It still needs repainting," she said with a smile. Adrian looked at the faded letters. "I know someone who could pay for that." Emily laughed and gently shook her head. "No," he nodded immediately. "Then we'll repaint it ourselves." She looked at him for a moment before offering him one of the brushes left over from the neighborhood festival. Early the next morning, before the cafe opened, the two of them stood together beneath the old sign, wearing paint-stained clothes instead of expensive suits or business attire. Neighbors arriving for breakfast stopped to watch in quiet amusement as one of the city's most powerful men carefully climbed a ladder, while Emily reminded him not to drip blue paint onto the sidewalk. The sign was never made perfect. A few brushstrokes remained uneven. One corner still carried the tiny crack her father had refused to repair. Emily suggested fixing it, but Adrian smiled and shook his head. "Leave it." She looked at him curiously. "Why?" Adrian stepped down from the ladder, wiped paint from his hands, and looked once more at the cafe that had changed his life twice, once when he arrived with nothing, and once when he found the courage to come back. "Because perfection isn't what brought me home." Emily slipped her hand into his. This time he didn't hesitate. Together they unlocked the front door as the brass bell rang softly above them, welcoming another ordinary morning on Maple Street. The old soup bowl rested proudly on its shelf. The restored photograph hung beside dozens of other family memories, and the little cafe continued doing exactly what it had always done best, reminding strangers that a single act of kindness, no matter how small, can quietly change the course of an entire lifetime.